In a time long before the bright colors and curious creatures of the land of old, the world looked very much like our own. Skyscrapers pierced the sky, libraries buzzed with quiet thought, and museums guarded relics from civilizations long past. Among the gentle hum of this world lived a man named Simon Petrikov, a kind-hearted archaeologist whose life was filled with the wonders of history and the slow, patient work of discovery. Simon was not the kind of man who sought riches or fame. His joy was simpler in old books, cracked paintings, and forgotten artifacts. He was tall and a bit gangly, with glasses perched on his nose, forever slipping downward as he leaned over ancient texts. His voice carried a soft, academic warmth, the sort of voice that made complicated ideas sound welcoming and alive. Hey, real quick, if you're enjoying this so far, I'd be so grateful if you subscribed. I put a lot of time and heart into making these videos, and every new subscriber genuinely helps me keep going. Thanks for being here. To those who knew him, Simon was a bit absent-minded, always drifting into daydreams about ancient kings and lost cities. But behind his awkward smiles and nervous chuckles was a mind of extraordinary depth. He loved the past not as a cold collection of facts, but as a living story, one that stretched behind every person, every city, every broken thing he touched. And so it was no surprise that one day, in a dusty, overlooked antique shop on the outskirts of the city, Simon stumbled upon something truly strange. It was an old, gleaming crown adorned with 3 red jewels and delicate gold filigree, resting quietly behind a cracked glass case. It called to him not with words, but with a deep humming feeling in the pit of his stomach, a feeling that this was important, that this was special. Simon, ever the curious soul, couldn't resist. He purchased the crown from the shopkeeper, an elderly man who seemed almost too eager to be rid of it, and brought it back to his university office. There, under the dim yellow light of his desk lamp, Simon examined it more closely. Strange inscriptions lined the inside, written in no language he could recognize. Symbols twisted and coiled like vines in a forgotten garden. He should have been cautious. He should have stopped. But Simon was enchanted. Playfully, he placed the crown atop his head, laughing at his reflection in the dusty mirror across the room. And that's when the world shifted. For a moment, it felt as though he had fallen into a deep, cold ocean. His vision blurred and a sharp, aching chill rushed through his body. Strange visions, flashes of distant lands, swirling skies, and ancient voices flooded his mind. And then, just as suddenly, it ended. Simon yanked the crown from his head, gasping, heart pounding. His hands were trembling, and when he looked in the mirror, he thought, just for a second, he saw something that wasn't quite him staring back. Something colder, something ancient. The next few days were a blur. Simon tried to dismiss what had happened, tried to convince himself it was just his imagination. But he knew better. Little things began to slip. Words he didn't intend to say fell from his mouth. Strange dreams haunted him, of icy kingdoms and endless loneliness. His fingers twitched at times, reaching for the crown even when he had locked it far away. He documented everything meticulously, filling page after page with observations as any good scholar would. But deep down, Simon felt a growing fear gnawing at his heart. This was no ordinary artifact. It was alive somehow in ways he couldn't yet understand. And still, part of him was drawn to it. Simon began wearing the crown in secret, telling himself it was for research. But the truth was simpler and sadder when he wore it. He felt powerful. He felt important. He felt needed. The whispers in his mind grew louder, weaving themselves into his thoughts like a slow, creeping frost. Yet despite the growing unease, life outside of Simon's private turmoil continued. He still taught classes, gave lectures, wandered bookstores with stacks of ancient tomes under his arm. And most importantly, he met someone. Someone who would change the course of his life forever. Her name was Betty. Betty Grof was everything Simon wasn't quick-witted, confident, a dazzling intellect who challenged and delighted him at every turn. She wasn't intimidated by his nervous energy or his clumsy words. Instead, she saw the brilliant, gentle heart underneath, and she smiled. Their connection was immediate, a warm, fierce thing that melted the cold creeping into Simon's soul. For the first time since finding the crown, Simon felt truly seen, truly anchored. Betty made him feel like a man again. Not a collection of fearful thoughts and strange visions, but someone real, someone whole. He didn't tell her about the crown. He didn't tell her about the dreams. In those early days, Simon believed he could control it, believed he could hide it away and bury the strange, terrible thing that had taken root inside him. He told himself that Betty didn't need to know, that it would only worry her, that he could protect her just by pretending everything was fine. And so he smiled, and he laughed, and he held her hand tightly as they explored the winding streets of the city, whispered dreams of the future under the cold stars, made promises neither of them understood the weight of yet. Simon truly believed that love would be enough to hold the darkness at bay. But the crown had other plans. Simon's life began to weave itself around Betty like a warm tapestry. They spent hours together, lost in conversation, their minds leaping from ancient civilizations to wild, beautiful theories about time, space, and human connection. Simon would watch her as she spoke, utterly enchanted the way her eyes lit up when she solved a riddle, the way her hands moved animatedly as she painted her ideas in the air. For a time it seemed the strangeness of the crown could be forgotten, sealed away like a bad dream. Simon felt himself breathe easier, smile wider, laugh with real joy. But in the quiet moments when Betty wasn't there to anchor him, the cold crept back in. There were days when Simon would wake with frost clinging to the edges of his windows, though the city outside basked in summer's heat. Days when he would find sketches in his notebooks. He had no memory of drawing cruel towers of ice, crowned with stars that burned cold instead of hot. At first, he dismissed them as tricks of exhaustion. Symptoms of stress, perhaps. After all, being a scholar was a heavy burden. Funding cuts, endless research proposals, the pressure to always know the right answer. Surely it made sense, he reasoned, that his mind might slip now and again. But deep down, Simon knew, the crown was changing him. Not quickly, not all at once, but piece by piece, like a glacier grinding down a mountain, and he was terrified. Yet how could he tell Betty? How could he explain the creeping chill in his bones? How could he look her in the eye and say, "I think something is wrong with me. I think something old and terrible has its hands on my soul"? He couldn't, and so he didn't. He smiled a little harder, hugged her a little longer, told himself that love would be strong enough, that he would be strong enough. It was during this fragile, trembling time that Simon and Betty's bond deepened. One rainy afternoon, caught between lectures and thunderstorms, Simon proposed to her. It wasn't a grand, sweeping gesture. It was awkward and earnest and perfect Simon, fumbling with the small, simple ring he had picked out. Betty laughing through tears as she said yes, over and over again. For a moment the future stretched out before them, like a shining path, a life of discovery, of wonder, of growing old together in a cozy, book-filled house by the sea. Simon wanted that future more than anything, but the crown did not. The more Simon tried to ignore it, the harder it pressed against the edges of his mind. Night after night, it whispered promises into his dreams, promises of eternal knowledge, of kingdoms all his own. Sometimes he would wake in a cold sweat, the taste of ice and iron on his tongue, his trembling hands reaching blindly for the crown even as he wept with shame. And worse still, Simon began to forget. Small things at first. The date of an important lecture, a meeting he had promised Betty he would attend. But soon the gaps widened. Entire conversations slipped through the cracks of his mind like melting snow. He would find himself in rooms he didn't remember entering, speaking in strange tongues he didn't recognize. And always, the crown waited for him, whispering, singing. One evening, Betty found him in his study, muttering to himself, the crown perched lopsided on his head. Papers fluttered around him like dead leaves, ancient symbols scrawled in frantic, freezing script. She called his name once, twice. No answer. When finally he turned to her, there was a flicker, a terrible, fleeting flicker, where she thought she saw something monstrous behind Simon's familiar blue eyes. Something lost. Betty, brilliant and brave, masked her fear. She crossed the room slowly, calmly, took the crown gently from his trembling hands. Simon blinked, confused as though waking from a long, cold dream. "Simon," she whispered, cupping his face in her hands. "You're scaring me." And for a moment the weight of what he had done, what he had become, crashed over Simon like a frozen wave. Tears welled in his eyes, and he fell to his knees before her, begging for forgiveness, for understanding, for a way to make it right. Betty knelt with him, holding him close, whispering promises they both wanted desperately to believe, that they would fix this, that they would find a cure, that love would be enough to melt the ice creeping into his heart. And maybe in another world it would have been. But the crown was ancient, older than memory, older than love. It had claimed kings and conquerors long before Simon Petrikov, and it was not about to release its grip now. Still, Betty refused to give up. Together they began researching the crown's history, chasing down obscure legends, deciphering half-forgotten languages, tracking myths that led them into the crumbling, haunted corners of academia. They found scraps of truth, tales of a king who had traded his soul for power over the frost, stories of a crown forged in madness, a relic too dangerous to be worn by any mortal mind. But the deeper they dug, the clearer it became the crown was not cursed in the way humans understood curses. It was a living thing, a parasite, feeding on the hopes, fears, and dreams of its wearer until nothing remained but a hollow shell. Simon was running out of time. There were days now when he didn't recognize Betty's face, when he recoiled from her touch, as if she were a stranger, when his words came out in broken, icy fragments of forgotten songs. And Betty, for all her brilliance and determination, realized the terrible truth. If she stayed, if she continued to stand by Simon's side, she would watch the man she loved disappear. Not all at once, but slowly, painfully, until there was nothing left but the crown and the cold. And so, with a heart heavier than any she had ever known, Betty made a choice. She would save him, even if it meant losing him. Betty began to work in secret. Long nights spent hunched over crumbling manuscripts, tracing symbols with shaking fingers. Days spent meeting with scholars whispered about in academic circles, men and women who studied forbidden magics, who spoke of objects that defied the laws of nature. She was desperate. She would have bargained with the stars themselves if they had answered. And Simon, dear Simon, continued to slip away. There were moments when he was himself again, fleeting, beautiful moments, when he smiled that lopsided smile, when he whispered her name like a prayer. But they were fewer and farther between, like islands in an endless frozen sea. Sometimes Betty caught him standing by the window for hours, staring blankly into the distance. Sometimes he sang strange lullabies to the empty air, his voice cracked and hollow. And sometimes, most heartbreakingly of all, he would look at her with tear-filled eyes and whisper, "I'm sorry. I'm so, so sorry," without even knowing what he was apologizing for. The crown was winning, and Betty's heart was breaking. In her darkest moments, she wondered if there was any Simon left to save, if she was fighting for a ghost. But then, a breakthrough. Hidden in a dusty, half-burned volume deep within a forgotten library, Betty found a passage, a whisper of hope. A theory that the crown's power could be severed not by force, not by destruction, but by reaching deep enough into the wearer's soul, by anchoring them to something stronger than the magic, stronger than the madness. Love, real love. Unbreakable, undeniable, absolute. Betty clutched the book to her chest, her heart pounding. Maybe, just maybe, there was still time. And so she planned. She would create a ritual, a tether between her soul and Simon's, something so powerful that the crown's whispers would be drowned out forever. A bridge across the cold, an unbreakable lifeline. But magic, as always, demands a price. Betty knew she might not survive. She knew it might not work. She knew she was gambling with forces far older and crueler than she could comprehend. And still she chose to try. Because that's what love does. It tries, even when there's no reason to hope. The night of the ritual, a storm raged across the city. Lightning split the sky, rain battered the windows. It felt as though the world itself knew something terrible and sacred was about to happen. Simon stood at the center of the room, dazed and silent, the crown shimmering atop his brow. His breath misted in the air, even as Betty's hands shook from the cold radiating off him. She surrounded him with ancient symbols, candles flickering weakly against the encroaching frost. She whispered words older than memory, binding her heart to his with every trembling syllable. For a moment, just a heartbeat, she thought it might work. Simon's eyes cleared. He looked at her, really looked at her, and whispered her name in wonder. Betty. But then the crown flared with a terrible, blinding light. The room was filled with a sound like 1,000 windows shattering at once. The magic recoiled, twisting and screaming, and Betty was hurled backward, slamming into the far wall. She lay there, gasping, broken. And when she looked up, Simon was gone. Not in body, but in soul. The man she loved, the kind, brilliant, laughing man who once dreamed of growing old together, was buried beneath layers of ice and madness. In his place stood the Ice King, a creature of loneliness, of confusion, of desperate, aching need. Betty crawled forward, tears freezing against her cheeks. She reached out a hand, pleading, begging. "Simon, please." For a moment, the Ice King tilted his head, as if something deep inside him stirred. But then he laughed, a high, broken, chilling sound, and drifted away, carried by winds only he could feel. And Betty, left alone in the shattered remains of their life, realized the horrible truth. She had lost him. Not to death, but to something far worse. To forgetting. The world outside continued on, blind to the tragedy unfolding in that lonely room. The city lights flickered. The rain washed away the chalk lines and broken candles. And Betty, brilliant, stubborn, heartbroken. Betty made a silent vow. She would not stop. She would chase Simon across time, across reality itself if she had to. Because even if he no longer remembered her, even if he no longer remembered himself, she would remember for both of them. She would find a way to bring him back, no matter the cost. The days that followed were a blur of snow and sorrow. Simon wandered the city like a ghost, clutching the crown close, muttering to himself in forgotten languages. People gave him wide, fearful berths. Children cried at the sight of him. Once a shopkeeper tried to intervene, offering him a blanket, a cup of coffee, some small scrap of human kindness. The Ice King had stared at the man with wide, confused eyes, then fled, as if kindness were a fire that might burn him. No one understood what had happened to Simon Petrikov. His colleagues at the university whispered about a breakdown, a tragic descent into madness. The newspapers printed a few short articles. Brilliant historian disappears. Famed researcher reported missing. And then, just as quickly, the world forgot him. Forgot the man who once dreamed of unearthing lost histories. Forgot the man who once loved so deeply he would have torn the stars from the sky for the woman he cherished. Simon Petrikov faded from memory, but he did not fade from Betty's heart. Wherever Simon wandered, Betty followed, though often from a distance, hidden behind crowds, behind shadows. She watched as the man she loved slipped further away with each passing day. Watched as the crown twisted his mind into a lonely parody of its former brilliance. The Ice King built castles of frost in empty lots, singing to himself in voices that echoed off broken brick walls. He crowned stray cats as his princesses, offering them clumsy, frozen gifts. He scribbled nonsensical maps across the sidewalks in chalk, diagrams of places only he could see. And through it all, Betty watched, hurting, hoping, refusing to give up. Because Simon had never once given up on her, and she would not fail him now. In her quiet moments, Betty would close her eyes and remember. Remember Simon's laugh, soft and surprised, as though he could hardly believe he was happy. Remember the way he would get so lost in a book he forgot to eat for hours. Remember how he used to hold her hand absent-mindedly while reading, as though anchoring himself to the real world through her touch. Those memories became her fuel. She began searching for a way to undo what had been done. If the crown had the power to twist a soul, perhaps there was a power that could untwist it. Perhaps magic could heal as well as destroy. Betty devoted herself to that idea with the same fierce brilliance that had once made her Simon's equal. Studying lost magics, hunting rumors of ancient artifacts, piecing together a plan from fragments of forgotten knowledge. She would find a way to save him, no matter how long it took, no matter how far she had to go, even if it meant sacrificing everything, even if it meant sacrificing herself. And so, slowly, Betty's journey began. A journey not just across the physical world, but across dimensions, through the labyrinth of magic and memory. A journey built on love so deep it could endure even when one heart forgot the other. The world would come to know her as a myth, a legend. But in the beginning, she was just a woman, chasing the echo of a man she could not stop loving. And as for Simon, he would spend centuries trapped inside a mind that was no longer his own, lost in dreams of princesses and palaces of ice, a lonely king ruling over an empty, frozen kingdom. waiting in some deep and broken corner of his heart for the one person who had once promised him she would always find him. Betty, the woman who refused to forget, the woman who refused to let go. And so we leave young Simon Petrikov behind, not as the Ice King, not yet, but as a man on the edge of a tragedy so vast, it would ripple across the world for generations. The next part of our story belongs to Betty, to her love, her grief, and her impossible quest to save the man who had once saved her heart. Before the crown, before the loneliness, before the madness, there was only Simon and Betty. Two brilliant minds colliding in the most unexpected way, in a world still untouched by magic and tragedy. It began, as so many important things do, with a spark. Simon Petrikov was already a rising star at the university, young, fiercely intelligent, with a passion for ancient history that made his lectures feel like grand adventures rather than dry recitations of dusty facts. Students flocked to his classes, not just for the knowledge, but for the infectious joy he carried into every room. Betty Grof, by contrast, was a whirlwind of chaos and brilliance. A student at first, though calling her student hardly captured it. She challenged Simon at every turn, firing off theories, poking holes in arguments, questioning everything with a fearless gleam in her eye. Most professors found her exhausting. Simon found her extraordinary. Their connection was instantaneous, like two pieces of a puzzle snapping into place after years spent searching. They spoke the same language, the language of wonder, of endless questions, of believing there was still so much left in the world to uncover. Late nights spent debating ancient myths over coffee-stained notebooks turned into longer conversations about dreams and fears, about who they were and who they wanted to be. They challenged each other. They comforted each other. They made each other better. And somewhere along the way, without either of them realizing it, friendship bloomed into something deeper, something inevitable. Simon was awkward about it at first. All half sentences and nervous gestures, dropping hints so clumsy Betty could only laugh and take the lead herself. Their first date wasn't candlelit or dramatic. It was an impromptu trip to a local museum that ended with the two of them getting locked inside after closing. Simon, ever the academic, immediately started lecturing Betty about the exhibits by flashlight. Betty, ever the mischief maker, kept interrupting with ridiculous questions just to make him laugh. It was perfect. From that moment, they became inseparable. Together, they made plans for the future dreams of expeditions to forgotten ruins, of books they would co-write, of a life spent chasing mysteries hand in hand. They weren't just in love. They were partners in intellect, in adventure, in everything that mattered. Betty often joked that Simon was like an old wizard trapped in a young man's body full of obscure knowledge and terrible at noticing when he needed sleep. Simon teased her back, saying she was like a wild fairy who had tricked him into believing anything was possible. But beneath the jokes was something real, a tenderness so deep it scared them sometimes. Simon loved Betty's fierce curiosity, her stubborn refusal to accept the world as it was. Betty loved Simon's endless kindness, his way of seeing value even in the smallest, most overlooked things. Together they built a life full of laughter, arguments that ended in kisses, long hours spent researching side by side, and quiet moments when the whole world faded away except for each other. They didn't need magic. They didn't need crowns or castles or grand declarations. They just needed each other. And for a time, that was enough. But life, like magic, is rarely so simple. One evening, in a dusty corner of an antique shop on the edge of the city, Simon found it. The crown. It was tucked away between a cracked mirror and a broken phonograph, almost as if it were hiding, waiting. Simon, ever the scholar, was drawn to it immediately. The intricate craftsmanship, the faint shimmer of ancient runes, it was unlike anything he had ever seen. Betty, more intuitive, felt an unease she couldn't quite name. A prickle at the back of her neck, a whisper that this was something better left untouched. But Simon was enchanted. Not by magic, not yet, but by curiosity. By the promise of discovery. He bought the crown for a handful of dollars and carried it home, chattering excitedly about lost civilizations and untapped histories. Betty watched him with a small, worried smile. She trusted Simon. She trusted his heart. But sometimes, the heart can lead you places the mind cannot follow. At first, the crown was nothing more than an oddity, a strange, beautiful thing that Simon kept on his desk, half buried beneath stacks of books and loose papers. He would sometimes pick it up absent-mindedly while lecturing Betty about ancient relics, or while losing himself in research that stretched long into the early morning hours. Betty would find him there, bleary-eyed, muttering about the crown's origins, tracing its runes with the tip of his finger, as if trying to decipher a secret only he could hear. She teased him at first, called it his shiny distraction. Tried to pull him back into the world with gentle jokes and kisses on his forehead. But something was shifting. Slowly, subtly. Simon became distant. Not all the time. There were still flashes of the man Betty loved, the warm, brilliant soul who would lose track of time because he was so excited to tell her about some forgotten civilization. But more and more often, he seemed lost inside himself. He would trail off mid-sentence, staring into space as though listening to a voice Betty couldn't hear. He would forget appointments, leave the stove burning, misplace things he had just been holding. At night he began to mutter in his sleep fragments of strange languages, broken pleas to unseen forces. Betty, ever practical, suggested they take a break from the crown. Suggested they go away for a weekend, somewhere quiet, somewhere normal. Simon agreed. Or at least, he said he did. But when it came time to leave, she found him sitting in his study. The crown clutched so tightly in his hands his knuckles were white. He looked up at her then, and for a moment she didn't recognize him. There was a wildness in his eyes, a flicker of something ancient and cold. It vanished almost instantly, replaced by his usual sheepish smile. But Betty had seen it, and she could no longer pretend nothing was wrong. They fought that night their first real fight. Voices raised, accusations flung like knives neither of them truly meant. Betty begged him to get rid of the crown. Simon begged her to understand. It's not dangerous, he insisted, voice cracking. It's important, Betty. I'm so close to something bigger than both of us. She reached for him then, not to fight, not to argue, just to hold him, to remind him of who he was. For a heartbeat, he leaned into her touch. The tension in his shoulders eased. The frantic gleam in his eyes dimmed. But then he pulled away. And Betty understood with a deep, wrenching certainty that the man she loved was slipping through her fingers. She didn't give up. Of course she didn't. Betty Grof was never the kind of person who walked away when things got hard. She stayed. She stayed through the confusion, through the pain, through the terrifying moments when Simon would laugh at things that weren't there, or stare past her as if looking into a world only he could see. She researched. She contacted colleagues, ancient historians, even fringe occultists, anyone who might know something about a crown that could twist the mind. And slowly, horrifyingly, a pattern began to emerge. Legends of a cursed artifact. A crown that granted unimaginable power at the cost of the wearer's sanity. A crown that chose its wielder, binding itself to their soul until little of the original person remained. Betty tried to tell Simon, tried to warn him. But by then, it was too late. The crown's grip had tightened. Simon could no longer tell where he ended and it began. There were moments, fleeting but precious, when he seemed almost himself again. Moments when he would look at Betty with tears in his eyes and whisper apologies she couldn't quite understand. Moments when he would beg her in broken whispers to remember him, to find a way to save him. Oh, moments that shattered Betty's heart into pieces so small she doubted they could ever be put back together. But still she stayed, because love, real love, is not a thing that falters when the storms come. It is a thing that digs in its heels and holds on tighter. Betty held on. Even as the man she loved faded into a figure of ice and sorrow. Even as the world around them began to collapse. Because she knew with a certainty deeper than fear that somewhere inside that broken shell, Simon was still there. Still fighting. Still waiting for her to find a way to bring him home. As Simon's condition worsened, so did the world around them. The sky seemed to grow grayer with each passing day, the air heavier, as if the earth itself could sense the gathering storm. Reports of strange phenomena began to spread, ancient artifacts awakening, creatures stirring from long-forgotten corners of the world. But Betty's world had already narrowed to a single point, saving Simon Petrikov. Her days were spent in libraries, poring over arcane tomes. Her nights were spent at Simon's side, coaxing him through terrifying episodes, comforting him when he couldn't remember her name, holding him when he collapsed from exhaustion. Sometimes he would vanish for hours or even days, wandering the city lost in fevered delusions, returning with cryptic warnings about the end of the world, about powers no human was meant to wield. And yet even in his most broken moments, when the crown's influence seemed absolute, Simon would always find her as if some small, stubborn piece of him still remembered that Betty Grof was his home. But time was running out. Betty could feel it. Simon's episodes grew longer, his moments of clarity shorter. His once brilliant mind, the mind that had dazzled and challenged and loved her, was crumbling under the weight of something far older and crueler than either of them had ever imagined. One evening, after a particularly frightening episode where Simon failed to recognize her, Betty made a decision. A desperate, terrifying, irreversible decision. She would not let him be taken from her. Not without a fight. Gathering every scrap of research she had, every occult text, and forbidden ritual she could find, Betty began crafting a plan. A way to break the crown's hold. A way to save Simon before it was too late. It was reckless. It was dangerous. And it was the only hope they had left. Betty knew she couldn't do it alone. She reached out to scholars and sorcerers, to the few remaining minds who had survived the growing chaos and still dared to hope. Together, they pieced together a ritual, a journey across dimensions, a leap into the unknown. The plan was simple, at least in theory. Betty would seek the ancient primordial forces that had created the crown in the first place, forces that existed outside of time and reality. She would find them. She would bargain with them. She would bring Simon back. Whatever it cost. The night before she was set to begin the ritual, Betty and Simon sat together in their small apartment, surrounded by the artifacts of a life they had built together, books, photos, half-finished projects. memories heavy with love and loss. Simon was lucid, just for a little while. He held her hand, trembling but firm, and he said, "I'm sorry, Betty. I'm so sorry." Betty smiled through tears. "You have nothing to be sorry for, Simon," she whispered. "You didn't choose this." He shook his head violently, tears streaming down his face. "I'm scared I'll forget you," he said. "I'm scared I already have." Betty pulled him into her arms, holding him as tightly as she could, as if she could anchor him there by sheer will. "You won't forget me," she said fiercely. "And even if you do, I'll find you. I'll bring you back. I promise." Simon buried his face in her shoulder, and for one precious moment, they were just Simon and Betty again. Not a broken man and a desperate woman, not victims of ancient magic. Just two people, hopelessly, endlessly in love. The next morning, before the first light of dawn touched the horizon, Betty completed the ritual. It was violent. It was terrifying. She tore open a hole in reality itself, stepping into a place no human was ever meant to tread, a place where past and future folded together, where the laws of life and death held no meaning. Simon watched her go, a cry of protest dying on his lips. He reached for her too late. And Betty, fearless and determined and shining with love, disappeared into the unknown. Simon was left standing there alone, the crown slipping once again onto his head like a predator, sinking its claws into prey. But in the deepest corner of his heart, a tiny ember of hope remained. Betty hadn't abandoned him. She was still out there fighting for him. And maybe, just maybe, she would find a way to bring him back. The place Betty entered defied explanation. It wasn't a world, exactly not a place with streets and skies and oceans, but a shifting landscape of memory, magic, and raw possibility. Here, the past whispered through the cracks of existence. Here, time had no power. Betty's mind reeled under the weight of it, but her purpose burned brighter than fear. Save Simon. She journeyed through realms ruled by ancient beings, forces of chaos and order, of creation and destruction. Each encounter demanded pieces of her, memories, dreams, even fragments of her identity. And still she pressed on, because what was the cost of herself compared to the chance of saving him? At last, Betty found the entity. She sought a being older than crowns, older than magic itself. A force that could reshape fate. For a price. The being spoke without words, offering Betty a terrible bargain. Her own existence given freely in exchange for Simon's restoration. It wasn't even a question. Betty agreed. But fate, cruel and tricky, twisted even her purest act of love. The deal she struck didn't free Simon from the crown's influence immediately. Instead, it tied her essence to him across time, threading her soul into the weft of his destiny. Betty became part of the magic itself, watching, unseen, as Simon staggered through centuries of madness and loneliness. Watching as the world ended and was reborn in strange, broken forms. Watching as Simon forgot himself completely and became something new. The Ice King. A figure of sorrow and absurdity. A joke to the people of Ooh. A villain to some, a nuisance to others. But Betty knew the truth. Inside the babbling, blue-skinned madman was still the boy who had once read her poetry by candlelight. Still the man who had once promised he would love her in every world, in every lifetime. Betty's love endured, even when Simon forgot her name. Even when he built towers of ice and kidnapped princesses, he barely understood. Even when he looked into her face once, fleetingly, when she momentarily pulled herself back into the material world and did not recognize her at all. She stayed, watching, waiting, searching for the moment she could reach him again. Centuries passed. Simon's mind, worn thin by the crown's magic, clung desperately to fragments of memory, a song here, a name there. Sometimes, in the quietest moments, he would murmur Betty in his sleep, though he no longer knew why the word hurt so much to say. Betty wept for him, but she never stopped believing, because love, true love, is patient. It is relentless. It is forever. And somewhere, deep within the frozen fortress of Simon's soul, the ember of their love still flickered, waiting for the moment when the two of them might be whole again, waiting for the day when love would triumph over madness, over magic, over time itself. And so Betty Grof, the woman who had leapt into the unknown without hesitation, became something larger than herself, a force of hope, a guardian of a love that refused to die. Their story wasn't over. Not yet. Because even in a world of magic and monsters, even across the yawning abyss of time, love remembers. And soon, their paths would cross once more in ways neither of them could have ever imagined. The world as Simon knew it had ended long before he truly realized it. The Mushroom War wasn't a single event, not one massive explosion, not one day of horror. It was a slow unraveling, a silent death creeping across the fabric of civilization. Tensions built like a pressure cooker. Nations armed themselves with weapons too powerful for reason. Leaders made decisions fueled by fear and pride. And when the first bombs fell, it wasn't just buildings that crumbled. It was trust. It was hope. It was humanity itself. Simon Petrikov lived through those days with growing terror. He saw the chaos firsthand. Riots in the streets, skies darkened with ash, families torn apart by desperation. And all the while, the crown whispered. It promised protection. It promised survival. It promised that if Simon would only surrender to its will, he could weather the coming storm. There were days when he nearly gave in, when the hunger gnawed at his stomach, when his hands shook from cold and fear, when the faces of dying strangers blurred together into a sea of sorrow. And still, some stubborn shard of Simon's old self resisted. He wrapped himself in worn coats instead of conjuring robes of frost. He bartered for scraps instead of freezing looters in their tracks. He told himself, I am still Simon Petrikov. I am still human. I am still me. But the war, the endless grinding horror of it, wore him down. Cities turned to rubble. Forests blackened into skeletal husks. The very oceans boiled and receded, leaving behind barren wastelands. Survivors became scavengers, then monsters. And magic long hidden, long suppressed, seeped back into the broken world like blood from an open wound. Creatures that had once been myth now prowled the ruins. Spells long thought forgotten now crackled through the ash-choked skies. Simon, scholar of the ancient, recognized the signs. He knew this was not just the end of civilization. It was the beginning of something stranger, something older, a rebirth through ruin. And still he fought. He wandered from settlement to settlement, offering knowledge, offering help, offering the flickering light of human kindness in a world that had forgotten what kindness looked like. And when they turned him away, when they spat at his strange appearance, when they feared the glint of the crown he tried to hide beneath rags, Simon would trudge on, heart heavier with every step. There were moments of clarity, brief and piercing. He would find a child huddled alone in the ruins of a once bright home, and he would sit with them, tell them stories of a time before the bombs, before the madness, stories of heroes and adventurers, of great cities and brilliant minds, of love, always, always of love. Because even as his mind splintered, Simon clung to the memory of Betty. The promise that somewhere, somehow, she was still out there. That he would not let himself become the monster the crown wanted him to be. But the price of resistance was steep. The crown, feeling his defiance, lashed out. Simon's body grew colder by the day, his skin taking on a permanent pallor, his fingers trembling with barely restrained magic. And the voice, that terrible, relentless voice, grew louder. It didn't scream or rage. It coaxed. It told him he was doing the world a favor, that his suffering was pointless. That surrender would be a mercy, not just for him, but for everyone around him. And in the broken, dying world of the Mushroom War, where hope was a rare and fragile thing, that promise was almost seductive. Almost. Simon held on. For Betty. For the memory of a world that had once been bright and full of wonder. Even as the cities sank into the earth. Even as the skies turned green and the oceans bled away. Even as the survivors devolved into warring tribes and twisted mutants. Simon wandered. A ghost among ruins. A man out of time, clinging to shreds of sanity in a world that no longer had a place for him. And always, always the question gnawed at him. How much longer can I fight this? How much longer can I be Simon Petrikov before there's nothing left but the Ice King? As the years dragged on, the world around Simon changed beyond recognition. Where once skyscrapers pierced the clouds, now jagged skeletons of twisted metal loomed over shattered streets. The green of nature, too, was altered, mutated into sickly, bioluminescent forests where strange beasts slithered between trees that oozed sap like blood. Simon wandered through these landscapes like a ghost, unaging, untouched by the passing of time in any natural way. The crown preserved his body even as it eroded his mind. Sometimes survivors would glimpse him and fall to their knees, mistaking him for a spirit, a frost demon, or a cruel god. Other times they hurled rocks and curses, driving him away in fear. Simon never fought back, even when mobs formed, even when they struck him with clubs or cut him with scavenged knives. He would endure it, tears freezing on his cheeks, whispering apologies to people who couldn't understand that he was trying to protect them from what he might become. Every act of violence against him, every rejection, every new horror he witnessed, chipped away at his will. At first he would turn to memories of Betty to soothe the hurt. Her laughter. The way she pushed up her glasses when she got excited. The smell of her old wool sweater when she hugged him tight on cold nights. But memories are fragile things. And in a world where the very fabric of reality was warping, even those sacred memories began to crumble. Sometimes he could no longer picture her face. Sometimes her voice, once so vivid, came back to him distorted and strange, like a radio half-tuned. The fear of forgetting her, of losing the last tether to who he was, gnawed at Simon more than hunger, more than loneliness. He tried everything to hold on. He wrote Betty's name on scraps of paper and tucked them into his coat. He sang old songs under his breath, lullabies she had once hummed absent-mindedly. He even fashioned the small, crude locket out of twisted metal, placing inside it a drawing of her face, sketched from the crumbling ruins of his memory. But the crown, sensing his desperation, pressed harder. It fed him false memories. It whispered twisted versions of his past, inserting fear, anger, suspicion, where there had once only been love. It told him that Betty had abandoned him, that she had never really loved him, that he was alone and had always been alone. Some nights, in the darkest hours before dawn, Simon almost believed it. And on those nights, when the cold inside him felt unbearable, he would don the crown fully and let the magic take control for just a little while. Just long enough to make the loneliness fade. Just long enough to forget. It was always a terrible mistake. Each time he gave in, the real Simon slipped further away, buried under layers of frost and madness. Each time it took longer to claw his way back, and the world outside grew ever stranger. The remnants of humanity were mutating not just physically, but culturally. New languages emerged from the ruins, new myths, new gods. Entire kingdoms rose from the ashes, built by survivors who had embraced the magic, now saturating the world's bones. Creatures once considered monsters talking dogs, candy people, flame folk became the dominant species. The earth Simon had known was gone, replaced by something wondrous and terrifying. And yet amid all this newness, Simon remained the same, an echo of a dead world. A man clinging desperately to a promise made long ago, a love story the universe itself seemed determined to erase. One fateful night, deep in the frozen wastelands of the north, Simon sat before a crumbling statue, a monument to heroes long forgotten. He stared at the stars, wondering if Betty was out there somewhere, still fighting for him, still believing in him. A fierce wind howled across the ruins, tearing at his ragged coat, biting through even the unnatural cold of his body. Simon closed his eyes. He thought about surrendering, just giving in to the Ice King once and for all. It would be so easy. No more pain, no more fear, no more heartbreaking memories, slipping through his fingers like sand. But then, in the back of his mind, he heard it. A laugh. Soft, warm, familiar. Betty. For one fleeting, crystalline moment, Simon could almost feel her hand in his. Could almost smell the faint scent of old books and lilacs. And in that moment, he made a choice. "I will fight," he whispered into the frozen wind. "As long as there is even one memory left, I will fight." Even if he lost everything else, his name, his mind, even his humanity, Simon Petrikov would not let go of that last ember of love. Not without a battle. And so he rose, battered and broken, and continued his endless journey through the ruins of a world that had forgotten him. A relic. A remnant. A man balancing on the knife's edge between salvation and oblivion. The Mushroom War might have destroyed the world, but it hadn't destroyed Simon. Not yet. As the world continued its slow, strange rebirth, Simon's journey grew even lonelier. The kingdoms that emerged after the Mushroom War were like patchwork dreams stitched together from the chaos of magic and mutation. The Candy Kingdom, ruled by a young Princess Bubblegum, shimmered pink and sweet against a backdrop of decay. The Fire Kingdom roared and flickered in the far south, a brutal monument to survival through ferocity. The Earldom of Lemongrab, the Wildberry Kingdom, the Slime Kingdom. Each new realm bloomed like odd flowers across the wasteland, vibrant and bizarre. And yet, among all this colorful life, Simon remained an outsider, a ghost from a forgotten past, wandering through a new world that didn't know him and wouldn't have understood him even if it tried. The creatures of this new age viewed Simon with a mixture of awe and terror. He became a legend whispered among them. The Frost Man, the wandering king of ice, the sad wizard of the north. Children sang eerie songs about the blue-skinned figure with wild eyes who could freeze you with a glance, but often simply wept into the snow. Simon himself hardly noticed the stories. Every step he took was heavier than the last. His mind was a battlefield now, a constant war between the memories he clung to and the madness the crown tried to drown him in. There were days when he would lose hours, even days, wandering in a haze, speaking in riddles and nonsense to the empty air. Sometimes he would think he saw Betty standing just beyond the next dune of glassy sand, or peeking from behind a melted skyscraper. He would call out to her, running, stumbling, desperate only for the vision to dissolve into smoke. It broke him a little more each time. The crown, sensing the fractures widening, grew bolder. It whispered not just to Simon, but through him. It made his voice change at times, slipping into sing-song, playful cadences. It made his laughter shrill and sharp, unnatural even to his own ears. And worst of all, it fed him false triumphs, grand illusions where he ruled over glittering ice palaces filled with adoring subjects, Betty smiling at his side. Waking from those dreams was agony, a reminder that reality was cold, empty, and cruel. Simon tried to anchor himself in small rituals. He kept a journal, though his entries grew less coherent with each passing year. He collected trinkets, broken watches, cracked teacups, bits of old, ruined books, little remnants of the world he had once loved. But nothing could hold back the tide forever. Magic twisted the land beyond recognition. Time itself seemed to warp and loop, creating strange pockets where centuries passed in days or moments, stretched into eternities. Simon could no longer tell how long he had been wandering. Decades, centuries. The world around him grew younger in a strange, surreal way, bursting with life and magic, while Simon aged internally, worn thin by sorrow and guilt. The beings who rose to power in this new world were not cruel, not always, but they were foreign to Simon in a way he couldn't articulate. They didn't understand the old world. They didn't miss it. To them, Simon was an artifact, interesting, maybe even valuable, but ultimately irrelevant. And Simon? Simon was tired. There were days he would simply sit for hours, staring into the horizon, the icy wind whistling through the ruins around him. He would think about Betty, about the life they should have had. The quiet house filled with books and laughter, the children they might have raised, the adventures they might have shared, a life stolen not by war alone, but by the treacherous magic of the crown. Simon no longer blamed the world for what had happened. He didn't even blame himself, not entirely. He blamed the relentless march of time, the indifferent cruelty of fate. And yet, despite everything, he still could not let go of hope. A small, stubborn hope that somewhere, somehow, Betty was still searching for him, still fighting to bring him back. That hope was the only thing that kept the Ice King fully at bay. The only thing that kept Simon Petrikov, the man, the scholar, the lover alive beneath the ice. But even hope has its limits. And Simon could feel those limits fraying. The deeper he wandered into the ever-mutating world of ooh, the harder it became to remember why he was fighting. The memories grew thinner, more dreamlike. Sometimes he would awaken in strange places, ice palaces he didn't remember building, surrounded by frozen statues of people he couldn't name. Sometimes he would find old journal entries written in a hand that barely looked like his own pages, filled with nonsensical poems, frantic sketches, pleading messages to a Betty who might no longer exist. Simon was losing. Slowly, Inevitably, he was losing. And as he sat one evening atop a crumbling watchtower watching the auroras dance over a mutated wasteland, he felt a quiet resignation settle over him. Maybe this was his destiny, to fade into myth, to become the Ice King fully and forget that he had ever been Simon Petrikov at all. To be in the end just another relic of a war that had broken the world and broken him along with it. But even as he thought this, he felt a spark flicker deep within him. A memory, clear, sharp, painful. Betty's voice saying, "I believe in you, Simon, no matter what happens. I believe in you." Tears welled in Simon's eyes, hot, then freezing against his cheeks. And once again he made a choice. As long as he remembered her, even imperfectly, he would not give up. Not completely. Not yet. Simon's footsteps crunched through fields of frost and glass. The world had shifted once again. No longer just a wasteland, but something stranger, a realm where magic and mutation ruled side by side, indifferent to the ancient tragedies that had birthed them. Simon often wandered near small settlements, now pockets of strange new creatures who lived without memory of the old world. They would stare at him, some in fear, some in wonder, as he passed by. Children would whisper about the Ice King under their breath, pointing at his long, ragged robes and the twisted, gleaming crown perched crookedly on his head. Sometimes Simon would wave. Other times he would simply move on, a lonely figure trailing a cold wind in his wake. He no longer knew exactly what he was searching for. Redemption? A way home? A miracle? Or maybe he was just searching for a place to lay down his burden at last. The seasons changed, or what passed for seasons in this strange new world. Great storms of magical snow would sweep the land, birthing crystalline forests overnight. Firestorms raged across distant mountains, painting the skies in blood and gold. In some places, the very earth would heave and shift as ancient magic stirred deep within its roots. Through it all, Simon trudged on, clutching his makeshift locket close to his chest, the crude drawing of Betty inside growing more faded with every passing year. The crown continued to gnaw at his mind, whispering promises of peace, if only he would let go. But Simon resisted. Not for himself, he had long since ceased believing he deserved salvation. But for Betty. For the memory of a love so powerful it had survived even the end of the world. And deep down, though he could barely admit it even to himself, Simon clung to the hope that Betty had somehow survived. That she was out there somewhere looking for him still. Sometimes in dreams he would see her, standing at the far end of a frozen bridge, calling out his name with a smile, reaching for him across an endless expanse of ice and stars. And he would run, heart pounding, arms outstretched, only to awaken, alone, with the cold crown buzzing against his temples. It was a cruel kind of hope, but it was all he had left. And then one day, a change. Simon awoke to a world he did not recognize, even more vibrant, even more impossibly strange than before. The kingdoms had grown. The creatures had evolved. New heroes had risen, young and brimming with the kind of hope Simon could barely remember. Among them was a boy with a yellow dog, laughing, fearless, charging headfirst into adventure. Simon watched from the shadows, his heart aching. He wanted to reach out, to warn them of the dangers lurking in the forgotten corners of the world, to tell them of the mistakes of the past. But he dared not. The Ice King's madness was too close now, simmering just beneath his skin. If he got too close, he might not be able to protect them. He might hurt them. And so he stayed distant, a silent guardian, watching as the world rebuilt itself without him. A relic of an era no one remembered. A man trapped between the past and the present, still clinging to the impossible dream of rescue. Still whispering Betty's name like a prayer. Still fighting. Still Simon. But for how much longer he could not say. As Simon stood on a lonely hill, watching the sun rise over the Candy Kingdom's pink towers, he felt something shift deep inside him. A tremor. A ripple in the fabric of his endless sorrow. Somewhere out there, a new journey was beginning, one that would bring him closer to his lost love, closer to redemption, or perhaps closer to final ruin. Only time would tell. But for now, Simon Petrikov wrapped his tattered coat tighter around himself, set his boots against the frozen ground, and continued walking. Toward a future he could barely imagine. Toward hope. Toward Betty. And with that, we close the sorrowful chapter of Simon's lonely struggle through the ruins of a post-war world, and open a new door. A door into the most powerful and tragic love story Adventure Time has ever told. The reunion of Simon and Betty, and the sacrifices they would make across space, time, and reality itself. After years of wandering, of struggling against the tide of madness, Simon Petrikov was finally swallowed whole. The man he had been, the curious scholar, the gentle soul, the devoted lover, was now buried deep beneath layers of frost and delusion. And in his place stood the Ice King. Not a king by any right, not truly, but a self-made monarch ruling over empty castles of ice and snow, perched high atop lonely mountains that no one cared to climb. The Ice King was not feared like the tyrants of old, nor was he respected, despite his strange and terrible magic. Mostly he was pitied, a bumbling, tragic figure whose loneliness radiated from him like a freezing wind. His kingdom was vast in theory, but hollow in practice, an endless expanse of frozen wastelands, glittering palaces without subjects, thrones without courts. And yet the Ice King wore his title with a strange sort of pride. He built his own crown, scepter, and robes of splintered ice. He declared decrees to flocks of snowbirds. He hosted royal banquets attended only by frozen statues he sculpted himself, giving awkward toasts to guests who could not reply. To Simon, or what was left of him, these rituals were vital. They gave shape to the shapeless loneliness gnawing at him from within. They made the silence feel a little less suffocating. But even in his delusions, something deeper stirred. The Ice King craved companionship desperately. It was a hunger that consumed him, fueled both by the twisted magic of the crown and by the very real, raw human need for connection that Simon had carried since before the world ended. And so he began. Kidnapping princesses. Not out of cruelty. Not out of hatred. But out of a desperate, tragic misunderstanding of love. In his mind, a princess was what a king needed. What he needed to finally be happy. He imagined them dancing with him in his icy halls, laughing at his jokes, cheering his lonely coronations. He thought somehow if he could just find the right princess, the right companion, everything would make sense again. He would be loved. He would be whole. But the princesses, of course, did not see things that way. They saw only a strange, babbling old wizard descending from the skies in wild fits of magic, snatching them away from their lives. To them, the Ice King was a villain, a nuisance, an oddity to be defeated, mocked, or pitied. Each failed attempt carved deeper scars into the Ice King's fragile heart. Each escape Each rejection, each tearful confrontation, chipped away at the last remnants of Simon Petrikov hidden beneath the madness. And yet, he never stopped trying, never stopped believing in some corner of his fractured mind that this time it would work, that this time he would finally be loved. Meanwhile, the world around him grew and thrived. Heroes like Finn and Jake rose to defend the kingdoms, becoming legends in their own right. To them, the Ice King was often more an annoyance than a true threat, a recurring figure in their lives, absurd and pathetic, and somehow enduring. They fought him, yes, but they also slowly came to understand him, to see the tragedy behind the madness. Finn, especially in his youthful heart, sensed that the Ice King was more than just another monster to defeat. There was something broken inside him, something sad and human, that even the wildest magic couldn't fully erase. There were times, rare but precious, when the Ice King's guard would slip, when he would weep openly in his lonely towers, when he would confess, in garbled, rambling speeches, that he didn't understand why everyone hated him. "I just want someone to love me," he would mutter, tracing frost patterns on the walls with trembling fingers. "Why won't anyone stay?" It was in these moments that the Ice King's tragedy became unbearable. Because deep down, he was not evil. He was not cruel. He was just lost. A man frozen in time, trapped in a prison of his own mind, reaching out again and again for the warmth he could no longer even fully remember. He composed songs, sad, strange ballads played on battered instruments, singing to no one about a life he barely recalled. He doodled in journals, drawing hearts and crowns and clumsy pictures of princesses he thought might save him. He talked to his penguins, especially Gunther, as if they were old friends, carrying on elaborate conversations to fill the crushing silence. And through it all, the memory of Betty, distorted, blurred but persistent, haunted him. He didn't know her name anymore, didn't remember her face clearly, but the feeling remained. A vague ache, a sense of something precious lost, a longing that even the crown could not erase. The Ice King thought he was seeking a princess, but in truth he was still searching for Betty, for love, for salvation, for Simon Petrikov. But he no longer knew it, and that was perhaps the cruelest part of all. Despite the countless rejections, the Ice King never truly gave up. Every failed princess napping, every scolding from Finn and Jake, every lonely evening spent singing to empty halls, none of it could extinguish the stubborn spark inside him. He believed that love was still possible, that if he just tried harder, acted sillier, built grander castles, sang sweeter songs, someone would finally say, "Yes, I'll stay." In his mind, it was all just a matter of getting it right. He threw extravagant parties, sending out invitations to princesses who, of course, never came. He staged tournaments for their hands in marriage competitions where he was the sole judge and the only participant. He even tried to write poetry, sprawling verses scrawled on cracked parchment, blending icy metaphors with childlike declarations of devotion. But none of it filled the aching void inside him. And the more he failed, the more the crown tightened its grip. It was not a sharp descent into madness, but a slow creeping freeze, a subtle erasure of the man who had once held Betty's hand in the glow of ancient museums. Now he chased after fantasies. He told elaborate, shifting stories about his past conquests, believing himself a grand romantic hero. In truth, he was often confused, unsure whether his memories were real or dreams spun by the crown magic. Sometimes, in fleeting moments of painful clarity, Simon would surface. Not fully, just echoes. A sudden sadness when he saw a young couple laughing by a fountain. An unexplainable urge to protect Finn instead of capture him. A pang of guilt after scaring a princess too badly, sending him retreating to his castle to cry into his beard. It was these tiny fractures that revealed the tragedy behind the Ice King's antics. Because buried deep within the frost, Simon Petrikov was still trying to do good in the only broken ways he knew how. His relationships, though bizarre, were earnest attempts at connection. He tried to befriend Finn and Jake, showing up uninvited at their treehouse with awkward games and badly baked pies. He tried joining wizard gatherings, desperate to fit in among peers, only to be laughed at for his foolishness. He even attempted to care for Marceline, though he no longer remembered why she stirred such protective instincts within him. Marceline, the girl he had once cradled after the world ended, the child he had sworn to protect when everything else had fallen apart. Now she was a powerful, ageless vampire queen. And though the Ice King couldn't place the memories, some part of him knew he had failed her, that he had let the world and himself fall apart. Their interactions were bittersweet. Marceline would sometimes humor him, playing along with his games or joining him for awkward music sessions. She could see what others could not, the ghosts of Simon Petrikov flickering behind the madness. And though it broke her heart, she knew she could not save him, not yet. The Ice King, for his part, adored Marceline. He saw her as another princess, another potential friend, another thread back to the humanity he had lost. But he could not remember why he cared so much. Why her songs brought tears to his eyes. Why her sadness mirrored his own. It was a cruelty deeper than any physical wound, a separation by memory and madness, by time and magic. Still, the Ice King tried. He never stopped trying. Even as the world changed around him, even as new heroes rose and fell, even as kingdoms crumbled and were rebuilt, he remained a lonely constant, clinging to the remnants of a shattered identity. He was a villain, yes, but he was also a victim, a prisoner in a golden crown, a king of nothing but ice and sorrow, a man who had loved so fiercely that the universe itself had punished him for it. And so he wandered his frozen halls. He played his sad, sweet songs. He kidnapped princesses, not out of cruelty, but out of a desperate hope that someone would stay. That someone would see him not as a monster, not as a fool, but as a man still worthy of love, still worthy of being saved. And even though the world saw him as nothing more than the bumbling Ice King, the truth, the heartbreaking, inescapable truth was that somewhere, deep beneath the frost, Simon Petrikov still waited, still believed, still hoped. And that fragile hope, more than any magic, kept the lonely king alive. As the years dragged on, the Ice King's loneliness grew into something almost tangible, a heavy fog that clung to him wherever he went. It shaped the very magic he cast. Spells meant to build grand kingdoms crumbled into sad, lopsided towers. Incantations intended to summon loyal subjects fizzled into gusts of cold air. Even his creatures, the snow monsters and ice beings he created, had a melancholy about them like reflections of his own fractured mind. In response, the Ice King began to invent new worlds within his imagination. If reality would not give him friends, he would create them himself. He spoke to furniture as if they were courtiers. He debated politics with icicles. He threw grand tea parties where only penguins attended, waddling around with little paper crowns perched on their heads. Gunther, his most faithful companion, became more than just a pet. To the Ice King, Gunther was a confidant, a royal advisor, a best friend rolled into one waddling, squawking bundle. And perhaps, on some deep magical level, Gunther was something more, touched by ancient forces beyond even the Ice King's broken understanding. But to Simon, or what was left of him, Gunther was simple, unconditional company. Someone who didn't mock him. Someone who stayed. Still, cracks in the Ice King's manufactured world continued to widen. He began to feel fleeting moments of crushing clarity, sudden flashes where the full weight of his isolation would slam into him. Late at night, lying on the cold floors of his empty castle, he would remember not details but emotions. The feeling of holding someone's hand, the sound of laughter in a sunlit park, the warmth of belonging. And he would weep, great racking sobs that echoed off the ice walls, shaking the fragile structures he had built to keep despair at bay. It was in these vulnerable moments that he sometimes reached out, not as a king, not as a villain, but as a broken man. He wrote letters he could never send, addressed to no one and everyone. Letters that said things like, "I'm sorry if I scared you. I didn't mean to be bad. Please don't leave me. I'll be better, I promise." They were tucked away in frozen drawers, forgotten almost as soon as they were written. Small, sad monuments to a soul still struggling beneath the madness. Even his interactions with Finn and Jake evolved over time. At first, they saw him as a simple antagonist, a guy to thwart, a pest to drive away. But as they matured, they glimpsed more of the truth. They saw how the Ice King didn't truly want power or conquest. He just wanted to belong. He crashed their parties not to cause trouble, but because he yearned to be invited. He kidnapped princesses, not for ransom, but because he believed in his broken mind that he was offering them a better life. And on rare occasions, Finn and Jake allowed moments of kindness to slip through their defenses. They would humor the Ice King, letting him join their games for a while. They would listen, patiently, as he babbled about imaginary royal decrees and ancient wizard duels. They would even sometimes pity him, not with cruelty, but with a deep, aching sadness. Because despite everything, despite all the chaos and strangeness, the Ice King was still human, or had been once. And some part of him remained. A part that longed for connection. A part that missed Betty. A part that still carried the unbearable weight of Simon Petrikov's love and loss. Marceline, more than anyone, understood this. She saw beyond the madness. She remembered the man who had shielded her from monsters and sung lullabies to her in the ruins of the old world. And though it hurt, she reached out to him gently, carefully trying to bridge the chasm that magic and time had carved between them. Their interactions were some of the few times when the Ice King's veneer cracked completely. When his songs, clumsy and strange, carried notes of deep, soul-crushing sadness. When his eyes, usually wild and unfocused, seemed to search hers with a desperate, wordless plea. "Help me," they seemed to say. "Remember me." But no simple act of kindness could undo the crown's grip. No single moment could restore what had been lost. Simon Petrikov was still there somewhere. But he was buried under layers of ice thicker than mountains, layers that only love, patience, and perhaps a little magic could ever hope to thaw. And so the Ice King continued, building new castles, crafting new friends out of ice and snow, chasing princesses with the awkward hope of fairy tales, writing songs that no one else would hear, lonely but never truly giving up. Somewhere deep inside, a tiny ember still burned the last piece of Simon's soul, whispering that maybe, just maybe, he was not beyond saving. Not yet. And as the world turned, as heroes rose and kingdoms fell, as magic waxed and waned, that ember endured, waiting for the moment when the frozen king would finally remember who he was and who he had once loved. The Ice King's existence became a paradox, endless motion within frozen stillness. He was constantly plotting new schemes, crafting new stories, chasing after new adventures, yet at the core he was trapped, immobile, frozen in a moment of heartbreak that stretched across centuries. He was a man running on a treadmill of loneliness, too lost in his own illusions to step off, too hopeful to ever truly stop. And yet, there was beauty in his persistence, a tragic, haunting beauty. Because in a world rebuilt from ruins where magic and madness reigned side by side, the Ice King was a relic not just of the old times, but of a kind of love that refused to die. A stubborn love that had survived apocalypses, transformations, even the slow erosion of self. In small, almost invisible ways, the Ice King left marks on the world around him, traces of Simon's original kindness, woven into the fabric of ooh. He taught other wizards songs, even if they laughed at him. He tried to care for the penguins of his realm, seeing them not as minions, but as family. He sang lullabies to the cold stars at night, soft melodies that carried across the frozen wastes, unheard by most, but perhaps heard by something greater. And most importantly, even when he didn't understand why, he kept reaching out. In dreams sometimes, Betty would appear. Not the real Betty, but his memory of her smiling, holding out her hand. He would chase her through fields of blue fire, across endless staircases of ice, always just out of reach. And even when he awoke shivering, confused, alone he remembered enough to keep searching, to keep believing. There was an innocence to the Ice King that shielded him from complete despair. A part of Simon that had refused to harden into cynicism, even after losing everything. And that spark, fragile, flickering but stubborn, would someday prove to be his salvation. Because unbeknownst to him, forces were moving. Fates intertwining. People who had once loved him. People like Marceline, like Betty, were not content to let him vanish into madness forever. They remembered. They cared. And in ways both grand and small, they would fight for him. Fight to bring Simon Petrikov back. The story of the Ice King wasn't truly a story of villainy. It was a story of tragedy, of love so powerful it bent the laws of magic and time, of a man who lost everything and yet, somehow deep in the frozen ruins of his soul, still waited for a chance to come home. And so the Ice King continued to drift through his lonely life, building ice castles, writing strange fan fiction, crashing parties where he was never truly welcome, lonely, but not forgotten, broken, but not beyond hope. And that hope, fragile, stubborn, luminous, would lead to something incredible. Because Simon Petrikov's story wasn't over yet. Far from it. In fact, it was only just beginning. Soon the threads of his past, the shattered pieces of his heart, the old promises whispered under ancient stars would start pulling together again, drawing him toward a fate larger than anything he could imagine, toward reunions long overdue, toward love lost and found again, toward the possibility of healing. But before that, there was one bond that mattered more than any other. One love story that had survived wars, madness, and even the collapse of the world itself. A love story that defied time. a love story between a simple man and a brilliant woman, a man named Simon and a woman named Betty. Their story wasn't simple. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and it would shape everything that came next. Long after Simon had vanished into the madness of the Ice King, Betty Grof remained behind a brilliant mind trapped in a world where the man she loved no longer existed. For most people, Simon Petrikov was a footnote, a tragic memory lost to time. But not for Betty. For Betty, Simon was everything. And when the magic that consumed him stole him away, she refused to simply mourn. She fought back. At first, Betty's journey was fueled by heartbreak raw, burning heartbreak that could have broken a lesser soul. She scoured the crumbling libraries of the world, piecing together fragments of ancient lore. She learned the secret languages of magic, decoding grimoires older than recorded history. She delved into sciences forgotten by the post-apocalyptic wasteland, weaving together technology and sorcery with a single, desperate goal: bring Simon back. Time itself seemed to conspire against her. As the centuries passed, Betty should have aged, should have withered into dust. But magic, that wild, unpredictable force, intervened. In a twist of fate and fortune, Betty was pulled into the time stream, shot forward into the future, into the land of Oo, the strange, colorful world born from the ashes of the Mushroom War. She arrived dazed and disoriented, but her purpose never wavered. Simon needed her, and she would find him. At first, seeing Simon again should have been a joyous reunion. But the man she found was not the man she had loved. He was the Ice King, silly, fragmented, lost. He didn't remember. He didn't remember anything. And yet, there were moments. Moments when Simon flickered through the cracks. When he said her name without knowing why. When he looked at her with eyes full of aching, unspoken familiarity. Those glimpses were enough. Enough to make Betty believe that Simon's soul was still reachable, still savable. But the path forward wasn't simple. Magic this old and powerful does not easily unwind. The crown's curse had entangled itself with Simon's very being. To free him, Betty would need to embrace magic even more deeply than Simon had, to risk her own mind, her own soul. She didn't hesitate. Betty threw herself into the heart of magic, bargaining with entities that even wizards feared to name. She studied the primal forces that shaped the world. She traveled to the time room, the very axis of existence, and demanded a chance to change history itself. But time, stubborn and cruel, does not bend easily to mortal will. The time room offered her a grim deal, an opportunity to shift reality, but at a cost she could not foresee. Betty accepted anyway, because to save Simon, to even try, was worth any price. Meanwhile, in the background, greater forces were moving. The comet that had struck the Earth once before the event that had triggered the end of the old world was returning. Golb, an entity of chaos and destruction beyond comprehension, was awakening. Golb was the antithesis of everything Betty and Simon had ever loved. It was entropy itself, a force that unmade not just worlds, but meaning, memory, and existence. When Golb entered the land of Oo, the stakes became existential. This was no longer just about saving Simon. This was about saving everything. And still, Betty remained focused. Through battles and disasters, through the terror of confronting Golb face to face, her mind stayed steady. Simon needed her, and nothing, not even the collapse of the universe, would stop her from reaching him. When the final confrontation came, it was messy, chaotic, terrifying. Simon, half aware and half mad, found himself sucked into Golb's monstrous form, memories ripping apart, identity fragmenting. Betty followed without hesitation. Within Golb's belly, a swirling nightmare of broken worlds and broken minds, Betty and Simon faced each other at last. Simon, confused and terrified. Betty, battered but unyielding. For a moment, Simon remembered. Really remembered. The scholar. The friend. The woman he had loved above all else. He wept, calling out her name not as the Ice King, but as Simon. And Betty, brilliant, stubborn Betty, reached out. Not to pull him back to her, but to sacrifice herself for him. She realized then that saving Simon wasn't about restoring the past. It wasn't about undoing the mistakes or erasing the pain. It was about giving him a chance to live, to truly live, in whatever future he could make. And so, in an act of pure, selfless love, Betty merged herself with Golb. She didn't fight Golb. She became part of it, tempering its chaos with her will, reshaping its infinite destruction into something just maybe slightly more merciful. In doing so, she saved Simon. She saved Ooh. She saved everything. But at the cost of her own existence. Simon was returned to the world no longer the Ice King, but not fully himself yet either. He was broken, grieving, lost. But he was free. Free because Betty had loved him enough to let him go. And in that act, Betty Grof, the brilliant, stubborn, beautiful woman who had loved a silly, brilliant man, became something greater than a hero. She became legend. In the aftermath of Golb's retreat, the land of Ooh slowly settled into an uneasy peace. The skies cleared. The land, so often on the brink of collapse, breathed again. Heroes were hailed, songs were sung, and life, strange, colorful, resilient, carried on. But for Simon Petrikov, the world felt hauntingly empty. He was free, yes, free from the crown's curse, free from the relentless madness that had clouded his mind for centuries. But freedom came at a terrible cost. Betty was gone. And Simon, once a brilliant scholar, now stood in a world he barely recognized, a future he had never meant to see, built atop the ruins of a past he could never return to. He wandered Ooh like a ghost, trying to fit himself into this bright, bizarre world. He marveled at the talking candy citizens, the magical kingdoms, the strange new customs. And yet everywhere he went, he carried a quiet, aching grief. He would pause sometimes in the middle of bustling towns, eyes unfocused, as if expecting to see her Betty, laughing as she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, her arms full of dusty books. But she was never there. Only memories. Whispers at the edges of dreams. For a time, Simon tried to reclaim pieces of his old life. He spent long hours in libraries, piecing together the histories he had missed. He befriended Marceline again, their bond deepened by centuries of shared sorrow. He tried writing memoirs, poetry, even silly stories as a way to give shape to the tangled storm inside him. But healing, real healing, does not come easily. Sometimes grief would hit him out of nowhere, a smell, a melody, a turn of phrase, and Simon would be overwhelmed, curling into himself as memories surged like tides. There were dark nights when he wondered if Betty had made a mistake, if saving him had been worth the cost. But each time he would remember her final act, the look in her eyes as she chose him over everything else. Love without condition, love without expectation. And he would find the strength to go on, because that's what Betty would have wanted. Not a Simon who drowned in guilt, but a Simon who lived, who laughed again, who found beauty in a broken world. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, Simon began to stitch together a new life. He became a teacher of sorts, sharing his knowledge of the old world with the curious citizens of Ooh. He taught archaeology to young adventurers, explained ancient history to wide-eyed candy children, told stories that blended fact and legend into something more beautiful than either. In this way, he honored Betty's memory by continuing the work they had loved, by inspiring wonder in others. Yet Simon never pretended that everything was fine. He spoke openly of his past, of his mistakes, of the terrible things he had done under the Crown's influence. He didn't hide from his pain. He wore it like a scar, or perhaps like a badge. And in doing so, he found unexpected healing. People listened. People cared. And through their kindness, Simon slowly, hesitantly, began to believe that he deserved forgiveness. Not just from the world, but from himself. Still, the ache for Betty never truly left him. How could it? She had been his light in the darkness, his anchor to the world. Even now, when he stood under the stars and closed his eyes, he could almost feel her beside him, a whisper on the wind, a warmth in the cold night. He would murmur her name sometimes, soft enough that no one else could hear. Not in desperation, not in mourning, but in gratitude. Gratitude for the love they had shared. Gratitude for the sacrifices she had made. Gratitude for the chance, no matter how painful, to go on living. And perhaps, somewhere beyond the edges of the universe, Betty heard him. Perhaps in some deep, cosmic way, she smiled. Simon didn't know. He didn't need to know. Because Betty's love wasn't something that needed to be proven. It wasn't a story with a neat ending. It was a part of him now, woven into the very fabric of his being. And so Simon Petrikov, once a scholar, once a mad king, once a broken man, continued to walk forward, carrying her memory with him, carrying her love with him, building a future not despite his losses, but because of them. Because in the end, that was Betty's final gift. Not just salvation, not just freedom, but hope. Hope that even after unimaginable loss, life could still be beautiful. Hope that love, real, fierce, stubborn love, could echo through time and space, changing everything it touched. Hope that even in a world forever changed, the human heart could endure. And Simon, carrying that hope, took his next step into the unknown. Not as a king, not as a prisoner of magic, but simply as Simon. And that was enough. Simon's journey after Betty's sacrifice wasn't a straight path. It was filled with twists, quiet regressions, and surprising new beginnings. At times he isolated himself, slipping into long periods of solitude. He would sit at the edge of old ruins, watching the sun dip below the strange, candy-colored horizons of Ooh, feeling small in a world that had outgrown him. Other times he would visit familiar faces. Marceline was often there, a comforting, constant someone who understood his grief without needing to prod it. They would sit together atop the old treehouse ruins, strumming melancholic tunes on their guitars, letting music say the things they couldn't find words for. It was Marceline who gently nudged Simon back toward the world whenever he retreated too far into himself. And it was Marceline who reminded him with her effortless, stubborn spirit that survival was not enough. Living was the goal. Even the odd friendships Simon formed surprised him. Princess Bubblegum, with her unyielding curiosity, often sought his expertise on ancient sciences and histories. Where once Simon might have crumbled under the pressure to perform, to be the genius everyone remembered, now he approached these conversations with a softer humility. He was no longer trying to prove anything. He was simply sharing knowledge, giving back, building bonds. In time, the people of Uu came to know Simon not as the Ice King, not as a relic of the past, but as someone new. Someone a little broken, yes, but also someone wise, funny, kind. A storyteller, a friend, an unexpected mentor to those who needed one. It was in these small, unremarkable moments teaching young wizards how to properly channel spell energies, baking pies disastrously with tree trunks, helping Finn decode ancient maps that Simon found something he hadn't known he was searching for, belonging. Not the belonging of the past, tied to a world lost in war and ruin, but belonging in the present. In this messy, chaotic, vibrant world of magic and mystery. It wasn't the future he had dreamed of with Betty all those years ago, walking through museums and planning a life together. It wasn't what either of them had wanted. But it was real, and it was beautiful in its own imperfect way. Still, there were nights when grief slipped its cold fingers around Simon's heart. Anniversaries he marked silently. Dreams where he heard Betty's laughter echoing just beyond reach. He learned not to push those feelings away, not to bury them, but to sit with them, to honor them, to let them remind him that loss was not the end of love. If anything, it was proof of its strength. One evening, during the brilliant golden hour that bathed Uu in a soft, surreal light, Simon stood by a small monument he had built of simple stone, carved with Betty's name, surrounded by wildflowers. No grand declarations, no magic spells, just a quiet place to remember. He placed a hand against the cool stone and whispered, "Thank you for everything, for her love, for her sacrifice, for teaching him, even after she was gone, how to be brave." A soft breeze stirred the flowers, and for a moment Simon imagined he felt her hand in his, not holding him back, but pushing him forward, encouraging him to keep going, to keep building, to keep living. The next day he took a small group of eager young adventurers out into the wilds of Uu. He told them stories of the old world. He taught them how to spot ancient artifacts buried beneath the candy-coated earth. He laughed when they argued about who had found the bigger treasure. He smiled when one of them shyly asked if he would come adventuring again next week. And for the first time in a long, long while, Simon felt a genuine, light-hearted joy bubble up inside him. It was small, fragile, but real, and that was enough. Simon would never stop missing Betty. Some loves are too large, too profound to ever truly fade. But he also understood now that her story, their story, wasn't only about loss. It was about resilience, about hope, about the way love can stretch across time, across death, and still leave the world better than it found it. Simon carried that legacy with him, everywhere he went, in every story he told, in every life he touched. He had been a scholar. He had been a king. He had been a prisoner of his own mind. And now he was simply Simon, grieving, healing, living. And that was more than enough. As the seasons turned in Uu, Simon's days grew fuller. Not busier, not frantic like the life he had once lived in the world before the war, but fuller in a quieter, richer sense. He taught. He listened. He helped repair old ruins, uncovering bits of forgotten history. He shared long walks with Marceline, debates with Bubblegum, and awkward, hilarious tea parties hosted by the ever-enthusiastic BMO. Little by little, Simon's life became a tapestry stitched together by moments of kindness, laughter, and resilience. And in the spaces between, In the quiet hours of dusk and dawn, he kept Betty close. He spoke to her sometimes, not expecting answers, but simply as a way of keeping her woven into his daily life. He would tell her about the strange creatures he encountered, the odd customs he was still learning, the books he was reading, the jokes he thought she would love. It wasn't the same, of course. It never could be. But somehow it was enough. Because Simon understood now that love didn't disappear when the people we love are gone. It changed shape. It folded itself into memory, into tradition, into the small ways we carry those we've lost with us every day. Simon carried Betty in the way he approached each new adventure with curiosity. He carried her in the way he mentored younger souls, encouraging them to think boldly and question bravely. He carried her in the way he looked up at the night sky, still full of wonder after everything he had endured. In time, he even returned to some of his old habits, cautiously, carefully. He read poetry aloud to no one in particular. He dusted off ancient relics and smiled at the absurdity of how little they mattered in the grand sweep of life. He even tried his hand at magic again, though now, without the crown's influence, it was clumsy, halting work. But he didn't mind. There was joy in the attempt. There was beauty in the imperfection. And there, too, he found Betty. In the trying, in the failing, in the stubborn refusal to give up. One crisp evening, under a sky spangled with stars, Simon sat at the edge of a hill, a steaming cup of tea warming his hands. He watched the auroras dance across the heavens, ribbons of color unfurling across the endless night. And for the first time in what felt like lifetimes, he allowed himself to truly dream, not of restoring the past, not of undoing all that had been lost, but of building something new, something worthy of the love that had saved him, something messy, joyful, heartbreaking, and magnificent. Life, real life, full of mistakes and miracles. A life that honored Betty not through grand gestures or impossible magic, but through the simple, stubborn act of continuing, of being. Simon closed his eyes and whispered a promise into the wind. "I'll keep going," he said. "For you, for us, for all the wonder still left in the world." And perhaps, somewhere beyond the stars, Betty heard him. Perhaps she smiled. Or perhaps, in a way deeper and truer than he could ever understand, she had never really left. She lived in every brave step he took, in every kindness he offered, in every story he shared. Simon Petrikov had been lost once. But now, at long last, he was found. Not because the world was perfect. Not because his pain was gone. But because he chose, every day, to carry love forward. To build a future from the broken pieces. To believe fiercely, stubbornly in tomorrow. As the night deepened and the world around him fell into a soft, peaceful hush, Simon lifted his cup in a quiet toast to the heavens. "To you, Betty," he murmured, "my best adventure." And with that he smiled a small, genuine, aching smile and watched the stars shimmer on, endless and eternal. Just like love, just like hope, just like the story they had written together. A story still unfolding, still shining, still alive. Time moved gently now. Where once Simon Petrikov had measured life in frantic discoveries, desperate searches, and battles with forces he could barely control, now he measured it differently in the slow blooming of trust, the quiet building of friendships, the steady stitching of a life back together, thread by fragile thread. He lived simply. His home was a modest cottage nestled on the edge of a sprawling meadow surrounded by tangled woods and ancient, crumbling stones that nature had long since reclaimed. No servants, no guards, no glittering towers or arcane laboratories. Just a crooked bookshelf sagging under the weight of old tomes, a wood stove that stubbornly refused to start on rainy mornings, and a worn armchair by the window where Simon would sit and read for hours, the light of day shifting quietly across the floor. It was a far cry from the life he had once known. And it was perfect. Visitors came and went. Marceline would crash on the couch whenever she was in the mood to swap stories and share terrible takeout food. Princess Bubblegum, always armed with new gadgets or bizarre experiments, would arrive unannounced, debating philosophy or laughing at old Earth jokes Simon thought he had forgotten. Even Finn, now older and a little wiser, would sometimes drop by sword slung over his shoulder, eyes bright with that familiar spark of adventure. Each guest brought their own energy, their own little storm, and Simon welcomed them all. Because for the first time in what felt like 1,000 years, he wanted to be part of the living world again. He wanted to laugh until his sides hurt. He wanted to cry without fear. He wanted to tell stories, not to relive the past, but to celebrate it, to pass it forward, to weave his memories into the vast, messy, beautiful tapestry of Uru. There were difficult days, too. Days when memories dragged him down like stones in his pockets. When he would wake from vivid dreams of another time, dreams so real that for a heartbeat, he would believe he was back there, in that old, bright world, standing beside Betty, young and unbroken. Those mornings he would sit by the window, clutching a cup of tea he barely tasted, and simply let himself grieve. No fighting it. No hiding it. Just sitting with the ache until it softened into something gentler, a sadness that honored what he had lost without erasing what he still had. Simon learned that healing wasn't a straight line. It was a spiral, sometimes circling back through old hurts, sometimes leaping forward into unexpected joys. And that was okay. That was life. He found comfort in the rituals of the everyday, tending a stubborn little garden that refused to grow in neat rows, feeding a flock of crows that had decided his roof was their favorite hangout, teaching young adventurers about history and magic, not with the sternness of a scholar, but with the humor and warmth of a grandfather figure. He even held story nights once a month, where travelers from across Uru would gather in his yard, sitting on mismatched blankets and rickety chairs to hear Simon spin tales of the old world. He told them about ancient civilizations swallowed by time, about the wonders of forgotten science, about love and loss and bravery and hope. Sometimes he even told them about himself. Not as a king, not as a villain, but as a man who had wandered through darkness and found, against all odds, a way back into the light. And the children would listen, wide-eyed, as the stars blinked awake overhead. Sometimes they asked questions. Hard questions. Did you ever get scared? Did you ever want to give up? Simon always answered honestly. Yes, he would say, voice soft. I was scared every day. I made mistakes. I hurt people I loved. I lost my way more times than I can count. But I kept going. Not because I was brave. Not because I was strong. Just because I still hoped there was something good waiting for me, something worth living for. And in their faces, young, eager, unburdened by the heavy chains of regret, Simon found proof that he had been right to hope. The future was already blooming all around him. He didn't need to save the world. He didn't need to fix the past. He just needed to be a part of the story. to add his small, honest thread to the grand tapestry. And that, he realized, was enough. Sometimes Simon would wander beyond the meadow, traveling through the quieter corners of the sleepy villages tucked between rivers, the forests humming with ancient songs, the ruins where moss had softened the bones of the old world. He wasn't looking for anything. Not adventure, not treasure, not even answers. He was simply walking, breathing, being. And in its strange patchwork beauty, welcomed him. He became something of a familiar figure to the people who lived beyond the great cities and castles. The old wizard with the kind eyes and the battered satchel of books. The man who would sit by a campfire and trade riddles with goblins or play simple tunes on a cracked flute for giggling tree sprites. The man who never carried a weapon, but whose presence felt like a shield, gentle, unshakable. At first, some were wary of him. Stories of the Ice King still lingered like smoke after a long-forgotten fire. Whispers followed him. Is that really him? The one who stole princesses? The one who sang to the snow? But Simon never fought the whispers. He never defended himself with grand speeches or demanded forgiveness. He simply lived. He helped mend broken fences. He taught village children how to read old runes. He listened to the stories of others without judgment, letting his actions speak for themselves. And slowly, steadily, the world opened its arms to him again. Not with fanfare, not with coronations or declarations, but with invitations to harvest festivals, homemade pies left on his doorstep, songs sung in his honor by children who barely understood the history they were healing with their laughter. It was enough. It was more than enough. In quiet moments, Simon would reflect on the vastness of time on the towering mountains that would someday crumble, the mighty rivers that would shift their course, the stars themselves that would burn out long after he was gone. And yet, he didn't feel insignificant. He felt connected, like a single note in a symphony that would echo far beyond the limits of his own life. Sometimes he would climb to the top of a hill at sunset, watching the sky melt from gold to violet, and wonder if Betty was somewhere among those endless stars. He would imagine her laughing at him, not unkindly, but with that mischievous twinkle in her eye, as if to say, "You finally figured it out, didn't you?" And he would smile, touched by a grief that no longer hollowed him out, but filled him up with gratitude. Gratitude for having known her. Gratitude for having loved so fiercely, so clumsily, so fully. Gratitude for still being here, able to remember, able to hope, able to love again in new ways, in unexpected ways. Simon often thought about legacy. Not the kind carved into stone monuments or shouted from history books, but the quieter kind. The stories whispered between friends. The traditions carried forward by generations yet to come. The way kindness offered today might ripple outward, touching lives he would never even know. He didn't need statues. He didn't need songs. He only needed to live each day with honesty, with compassion, with wonder. That would be his legacy. A soft, stubborn light against the vastness of time. And as he sat one evening by a crackling fire, BMO playing a soft, wandering melody on a tiny guitar, Finn and Jake arguing good-naturedly over who could cook the worst marshmallow, Marceline laughing so hard she nearly toppled over, Simon felt something he hadn't dared to feel fully before. Peace. Not because his story was perfect. Not because all the wounds had healed neatly, but because he had embraced it all, the beauty and the pain, the triumphs and the failures, and made something whole from the pieces. As the firelight danced across familiar faces, Simon closed his eyes and breathed it all in. This was it. This was life. Messy. Precious. Magnificent. And he was here for it. Fully, wonderfully, imperfectly here. Time, as it always does, kept flowing onward. The seasons spun their ancient wheel spring, unfurling bright and green across the hills. Summer heavy with the hum of cicadas and the sweetness of ripe berries, autumn painting the world in golds and russets, and winter blanketing everything in soft, forgiving white. Simon found himself savoring each one. He marveled at the stubborn crocus pushing up through late snow. He smiled at the lazy afternoon spent fishing by quiet streams. He walked through forests ablaze with the fire of autumn leaves, letting them crunch underfoot like tiny paper prayers. He sat beside crackling hearths on cold nights, sipping spiced tea and listening to the wind tell old stories. There was a kind of magic in the ordinary, he realized. A magic just as powerful, perhaps, even more powerful than all the ancient spells and artifacts he had once chased with such desperation. Because this magic was real. It was here. It was now. It was the laughter shared between friends. The weight of a cat curled asleep on his lap. The way the stars winked shyly through thin winter clouds. It was the everyday miracle of simply being alive. One evening, as twilight wrapped the world in blue velvet, Simon sat beneath a gnarled oak tree on the highest hill above his home. The town lay below him, golden with lantern light. He could hear faint music drifting up from a distant festival, the thrum of drums, the sweet skirl of flutes, the rise and fall of joyous voices. And for the first time, in what felt like forever, Simon allowed himself to dream not of restoring the past, not of undoing his mistakes, but of building something new, of teaching, of telling stories, of growing gardens, not empires, of giving more than he took, of loving without fear. He took out a small, battered notebook, one he had carried through countless journeys, but had rarely written in, and began to scribble. Not spells, not warning, just thoughts, memories, dreams. Tiny seeds he hoped might someday bloom in someone else's heart. He didn't know what the future held, and that was okay. Because he had learned that the future was not a place waiting to be reached. It was something created moment by moment, with every choice, every kindness, every breath. He had been a scholar, a fool, a villain, a king, a madman, a ghost. But now, finally, he was simply Simon. And that was enough. Maybe someday, long after he was gone, someone would find his little notebooks, tucked away in forgotten corners of the world. Maybe they would read his words and smile. Maybe they would feel less alone. Maybe they would understand that even in a world shattered and strange, love and hope and healing were still possible. That the smallest lives could still sing the loudest songs. That broken things could still be beautiful. Simon closed the notebook gently and leaned back against the oak tree, watching as the first stars shyly appeared overhead. Above him, the heavens stretched wide and wild and unknowable. And somewhere in some corner of the endless universe, he liked to believe Betty was smiling too. Not waiting for him. Not trapped in the past. But moving forward just like he was. Dancing onward into whatever came next. Simon closed his eyes and whispered a soft thank you to her. To the world. To the tangled, miraculous mess of his own life. Thank you for it all. For the love. For the pain. For the journey. For the chance to begin again. And in that quiet, starlit moment, with the cool breeze brushing his hair and the steady beat of his heart anchoring him to the earth, Simon Petrikov, scholar, survivor, storyteller, finally, fully, wonderfully lived. The end.